Hi, everyone. Welcome to part one of The New Right. Our questions to think about here: how did President Nixon fit into the political realignment of the late 1960s and early 1970s? And why was the economy of the late 1960s and 1970s so bad? When we take a look back at the 1968 presidential election, one of the things that we see here is a noticeable political realignment. The civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, the student movements had all contributed to a leftward leaning of the Democratic Party, sometimes referred to as the New Left. And then at the same time, we see this shift in the southern states. When President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, he basically recognized that he had handed over the southern states to the Republican Party for the foreseeable future. So this political realignment of the South really begins in 1964 and 1965. And that is what Nixon is going to capitalize on in this election. The other thing that's going to happen here is Richard Nixon is going to really pay attention to what he called the silent majority. Those of middle America, those middle class citizens fed up with liberal politics and the radical culture of the 1960s. And so he says, "Tonight to you, the great silent majority of my fellow Americans, I ask for your support." So what Nixon is sort of betting on here is that those who are not involved in the student protests or the anti-war protests or the civil rights movement have been really just sitting quietly in their living rooms, frustrated with American politics, and that they supported the war in Vietnam, but they didn't really do that publicly because of the backlash with the anti-war movement. Fast forward to 2016 and take a look at the picture in the upper right. I wonder if this man recognizes the historical context of the term silent majority. And if we think about the silent majority helped Donald Trump be elected to the presidency, it sort of gives us some insight into Nixon's popularity in 1968. When Nixon is elected president, he recognizes that there is an opportunity with luring the southern states into the Republican Party. Now, keep in mind, there has been this very lengthy stigma associated with the Republican Party in the South. Many people still referred to the Republican Party as the party of Lincoln. I mean, think about the weight of that wordage. And so what Richard Nixon here is going to do is he's going to find various ways to entice Southerners to come into the Republican Party. And so one of the things that he's going to do is he recognizes that the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was incredibly popular. And when Congress votes to extend its life, Nixon deliberately vetoes. He knows that Congress has the numbers to override his veto, but what he can say to the southern states is, look, hey, I tried to stop this, but Congress overrode me. Another thing that Nixon is going to do in order to lure Southerners into the Republican Party is to make promises to appoint pro-Southern justices to the United States Supreme Court. We still have a lot of the civil rights issues coming up before the Supreme Court. And so Nixon is telling the South that when he gets the opportunity to appoint a justice to the Supreme Court, he will make sure that they support the ideals of the white South. Most notably, though, in 1969, Nixon does this sort of brilliant political maneuver where he asked the Justice Department. Now, keep in mind that the Justice Department is part of the president's cabinet, and the head of the Justice Department, the Attorney General, is appointed by the president. So really, when we talk about the executive branch, the cabinet is instrumental in making sure the laws passed by Congress are carried out. But in 1969, President Nixon is going to ask the Justice Department to ask the courts to delay integration of public schools, to delay the desegregation of public schools. Now, what's interesting about this is Nixon knows in advance that the courts are going to say no. And then once again, he has the opportunity to tell the Southerners, look, I tried to delay this, but the courts wouldn't go for it. So these are some of the brilliant tactics that Nixon's going to use as part of his Southern strategy. One of the challenges that President Nixon is going to face is that the economy of the late 1960s and 1970s is just plain terrible. And in fact, we have this sort of unusual situation where we have a declining economy, we have a recession, but at the same time, we're having inflationary prices. And these two things typically don't happen at the same time. In fact, this situation is so unusual that economists had to come up with a new term, stagflation. So inflation is when the prices of goods and services go up from one year to the next. And typically, economists like a small amount of inflation because it's a sign that the economy is moving and growing. 3% is a happy number for economists. But the problem that we have here is that we're seeing massive inflation. We're seeing double-digit inflation, 12% by 1974. And at the same time, unemployment is increasing, which is a sign that the economy is slowing down. And so typically these two things would operate like a seesaw, like a teeter-totter. When one goes up, the other goes down. But they're both going up in this moment. And what makes this particularly challenging is that what we would normally do to lower inflation will cause unemployment. And the things that we would normally do to get the economy rolling, to lessen unemployment, will cause inflation. And so we're experiencing the worst recession since World War II, and we don't have a strategy for getting out of this. So why is this happening? Economists like to use this fun analogy of guns and butter, and it recognizes that a country has a limited amount of money to spend on resources. And so guns represent those of the foreign policy realm, and butter represents those domestic issues. And so the more money you spend on guns, the less money you have available to spend on butter. But during President Johnson's time in office, we have the Vietnam War that is escalating, and the government is spending more and more money on the Vietnam War. And at the same time, President Johnson refuses to cut spending on his Great Society programs, the butter. And so Johnson is unwilling to raise taxes in order to pay for these things. So as a result, we are facing huge deficits, and that is going to have an impact on the economy moving forward. Second, we're seeing a greater international competition from countries like West Germany and Japan. So that's going to cause problems for American manufacturing. Third, OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, has placed an embargo on the United States for supporting Israel in the Yom Kippur War. So the Arab nations that helped to create OPEC are refusing to sell oil to the United States. And the United States has pretty vast resources of oil. But it's cheaper and easier to import the oil than it is to enhance drilling. So when OPEC cuts sales of oil to the United States, it causes a huge problem. It causes inflation. Because think about it. If we're talking about the price of bread going up, farmers grow the wheat, but they now have to pay more for diesel for their tractors. And they have to pay more for fuel for their trucks to bring it to the grain elevators. It costs more for those products to be processed and then shipped to the grocery store. So every step of the way has gotten more expensive, and this contributes to the inflation of the 1970s. And then finally, we have the increase in the size of the workforce as a result of the baby boom generation. From 1965 to 1980, the American workforce grew by 40%. 30 million workers were added to the workforce, which means all of a sudden there's not enough jobs available for all the people looking for work. So coming back to our questions to think about, how did President Nixon fit into the political realignment of the late 1960s and early 1970s? First and foremost, President Nixon is going to encourage Southerners to come into the Republican Party with his Southern strategy. So he's making this concerted effort to draw them in. And then second, Nixon places a lot of attention on what he calls the silent majority, or middle America. And this group was sort of divided between moderate Democrats and moderate Republicans. And what Nixon is going to do is speak directly to them and draw them into the party. The second question, why was the economy of the late 1960s and 1970s so bad? Part of the answer is President Johnson's attempt to fund both the Vietnam War and the Great Society programs without raising taxes, so that guns and butter thing. Second, we're starting to see a greater amount of international competition from nations like West Germany and Japan. Third, we have the OPEC oil embargo, which is contributing to the issue of inflation. And then finally, the increasing workforce. By adding the baby boom generation to the workforce, we're seeing widespread unemployment. So stay tuned for part 2 of The New Right.